In today's video, we're looking at the worst deaths ever recorded, from a photographer mauled by a grizzly to a guide swept away by flash floods. These stories show how quickly nature's beauty can turn deadly. It was May 3rd, 2023. The sun had risen high over the 6-lane stretch of the Yamuna Expressway near Aligarh, its asphalt surface shimmering in the late morning heat. The toll road, engineered for speed with minimal curves and endless sightlines, had become an unofficial proving ground for India's motor vloggers. That morning, one of its most visible faces would attempt his final ride. Agastya Chauhan, a 22-year-old creator from Dehradun, had built his YouTube empire on motorcycle riding, stunts, and high-speed highway vlogs. His channel boasted over 1 million subscribers who followed his candid rides, city-to-city runs, and increasingly dangerous speed challenges. His Kawasaki ZX-10R superbike, capable of exceeding 180 miles per hour, had become his signature weapon in the pursuit of viral content. Chauhan had spent 3 years methodically building his brand around extreme motorcycle content, studying traffic patterns and highway layouts to maximize both safety and spectacle. His protective gear was professional grade, his bike meticulously maintained. But critics had long warned about the risks of his unsanctioned speed trials filmed in real traffic conditions. That morning, Chauhan departed with a small group of friends to record what he called his cleanest 300. An attempt to reach 186 miles per hour on a straightaway. He wore a full-face helmet fitted with a GoPro and complete protective gear, while his friends followed on their own bikes to capture multiple angles. Recent accidents on the same expressway stretch had claimed multiple lives, including several tied to vloggers and influencers attempting high-speed content. Warnings circulated through Indian biking forums about increased police enforcement and dangerous road conditions. Despite the risks, Chauhan pushed ahead with his ambitious speed run. According to footage recovered later and corroborated by highway surveillance cameras, Chauhan began accelerating near mile marker 76, his friends trailing safely behind. Somewhere above 174 miles per hour, disaster struck. His bike began veering toward the concrete divider. Whether from crosswind, rider error, or mechanical failure remained unclear. At those speeds, recovery was impossible. When the front tire caught the edge of the concrete divider, the 400-pound motorcycle snapped sideways and launched into the air. Chauhan was ejected violently, his body ragdolling mid-flight before slamming helmet first into the asphalt. The impact split the helmet shell on contact, the force compressing his neck with lethal torque. He bounced once, then slid across the pavement limp and lifeless, leaving a wide smear of blood and shredded fabric in his wake. His friends stopped immediately, sprinting to his motionless form, but Chauhan was unresponsive. Emergency medical services arrived within 15 minutes, called by his friends, but he had suffered massive head trauma and was declared dead at the scene. News of Chauhan's death spread rapidly through Indian social media. Within hours, his recent videos were flooded with comments expressing disbelief and grief. The Ministry of Road Transport and Highways issued renewed warnings against high-speed filming on public roads. Chauhan's funeral in Dehradun drew hundreds of bikers and fans who had followed his journey from early uploads to viral stardom. It was July 4th, 2017, and the pre-dawn darkness slowly gave way to the first hints of sunrise over Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. The 14,259-foot summit of Long's Peak loomed ahead, its granite face catching the early morning light as hikers began their Independence Day ascent. The thin mountain air carried the scent of alpine flowers and the promise of afternoon thunderstorms that regularly developed over Colorado's high peaks. Emma Rodriguez laced up her hiking boots in the parking lot, her headlamp cutting through the darkness as she prepared for the challenging climb ahead. At 26, the hiking enthusiast had made conquering Colorado's 58 peaks over 14,000 feet her personal mission, checking off summits with the methodical dedication of someone who'd found her true passion. Her compact frame belied the strength she'd developed through years of high-altitude hiking. Emma's plan was flawless in its simplicity. Start hiking at 4 a.m. to reach the summit by noon, then descend quickly to avoid the afternoon thunderstorms that commonly developed over the Front Range. Weather forecasts predicted storm activity after 2 p.m. giving her a comfortable margin of safety for the 15-mile round trip that typically took experienced hikers 12 to 14 hours to complete. The Longs Peak Trail was familiar territory for Emma, who'd attempted the summit twice before but been turned back by weather and equipment issues. This time she carried proper gear including rain protection, extra layers, and emergency supplies. Her meticulous preparation reflected the respect she'd developed for Colorado's unpredictable mountain weather through 30 previous 14er climbs. As Emma climbed through the pre-dawn darkness, her headlamp illuminated the rocky trail that wound through dense forest before emerging above treeline. The physical challenge energized her as she settled into the steady rhythm that would carry her to the summit. Other hikers had started early as well, their lights creating a constellation of moving stars on the mountainside. The weather began changing earlier than anyone expected as Emma approached the exposed summit ridge. Clouds that should have developed in mid-afternoon began building before 11 a.m., driven by unusual atmospheric conditions that caught even experienced meteorologists off guard. The first rumbles of thunder echoed across the peaks, while Emma was still 500 feet below the summit. Emma immediately recognized the danger and began descending, abandoning her summit attempt without hesitation. But the storm's rapid development had already placed her in an extremely vulnerable position, caught above treeline with no shelter and nowhere to hide from the electrical activity building overhead. The nearest trees were over a mile away and 1,000 feet below her current position. The lightning strike came without warning. As Emma hurried down the exposed granite slabs, the bolt hit the rocky peak directly, with electrical current traveling through the ground and up through Emma's body as she stood on the conductive stone. The massive electrical discharge stopped her heart instantly, while causing severe burns throughout her nervous system. Other hikers witnessed the strike from safer positions lower on the mountain, but continued lightning activity prevented them from reaching Emma's position for over an hour. When rescue teams finally arrived, they found her body on the granite slabs where she'd fallen. Her hiking poles melted and her metal gear fused by the electrical current. Emma's death prompted renewed education about lightning safety and the unpredictability of mountain weather. Rocky Mountain National Park installed additional weather monitoring stations, while her family advocated for better lightning safety education in hiking courses nationwide. It was August 17, 2013. Apodaca's industrial sprawl stretched across the outskirts of Monterrey, where workers at a small vehicle depot lingered past closing time. Alejandro Alex Flores stood beneath a street lamp, chatting with two co-workers about weekend plans. What they didn't know was that Alex's quiet resistance over the past few months had reached its breaking point. Alex was a 32-year-old school bus mechanic. He was known for being organized, punctual, and soft-spoken. He'd worked the same job for 8 years, maintaining the yellow buses that carried children through San Nicolas. His modest house sat on a quiet street where he lived with his wife Maria and their 2 children, ages 6 and 4. Friends described him as a man who kept his head down and took care of his family, exactly the kind of person who should have been left alone. When a local gang began demanding weekly protection fees from neighborhood businesses, Alex made a decision that would cost him everything. He refused to pay, believing that giving in meant permanent entanglement with criminals who would never stop asking for more. Over the following weeks, he filed quiet complaints with police, submitting license plates and descriptions anonymously. There was no formal protection program, just vague promises of follow-up that never materialized. Days went on and the threats escalated. Gang members began mentioning his family by name, asking about his children's school schedule. Alex confided in close friends, but still showed up to work every day, hoping the situation would resolve itself. That evening, as the shop lights dimmed and his co-workers smoked cigarettes on the curb, Alex looked more tense than usual. He'd recently learned from a neighbor that strangers had been asking questions about his kids. At 7:45 in the evening, 2 men approached from the end of the street. According to eyewitness Jose Ruiz, one wore a dark hoodie pulled low over his face. The other had a bandana masking his features. They walked with purpose but didn't run, closing the distance quickly. When they were within arm's reach, the hooded man said plainly that it was for not paying, and before Alex could react, he drew a short blade from his waistband and lunged. Alex turned to run but managed only 2 steps before the attacker slashed his neck from behind. He stumbled forward and collapsed into the gutter, one hand gripping his throat as blood poured. Jose shouted and rushed forward as the second man delivered a vicious kick to Alex's ribs. Both assailants fled down the narrow alley, disappearing into the maze of industrial buildings. Jose knelt beside his co-worker, desperately trying to compress the wound while another mechanic ran for shop rags and called for help. Within minutes, Alex's breathing became shallow, then stopped entirely. Paramedics arrived 12 minutes later, but it was far too late. Alex had bled out, the fatal wound a deep slash across the side of his neck. Surveillance footage from a nearby warehouse captured part of the attack, providing investigators with critical evidence. Using Jose's detailed description, police arrested 2 suspects in early September, both low-level gang members under 25. Alex's second cousin arranged a private funeral in Monterey, attended by family and co-workers who remembered him as a good man who'd simply tried to do the right thing. The local press ran a brief story in the crime section. Mechanic killed over extortion refusal. No larger investigation followed. The garage reopened 2 days later, and life continued as if Alex Flores had never existed. It was June 22, 2016, when Amber Callahan's perfectionist nature would ultimately seal her fate in the most horrific way imaginable. The 31-year-old senior escalator technician had built an impeccable reputation over her 12-year career with Metropolitan Elevator Services. Colleagues knew her as meticulous, detail-oriented, and someone who had never recorded a single safety violation. Her expertise made her the go-to person for Chicago's most challenging mechanical problems. That night, Union Station's main escalator had been producing disturbing grinding noises for weeks. Multiple repair attempts had failed to resolve the intermittent issues plaguing the aging 1970s-era system. The station management finally called Callahan for what they hoped would be a definitive solution. Security footage captured her arrival at 2:15 a.m., carrying specialized diagnostic equipment through the nearly empty terminal. The timing was perfect for maintenance work, with minimal passenger traffic and full access to the mechanical systems. She had specifically requested the overnight shift to avoid disrupting the thousands of daily commuters who relied on this critical transportation hub. Callahan descended into the escalator's mechanical pit beneath the moving stairs, immediately identifying the source of the problem. Several critical safety bolts had sheared completely off, causing the main drive chain to slip dangerously out of alignment. The situation was worse than anyone had anticipated, requiring immediate intervention to prevent complete system failure. Working alone due to overnight staffing limitations, she began adjusting the tension mechanism to realign the heavy steel chain. The older escalator lacked modern safety features that would have automatically shut down the system during maintenance. As she maneuvered around the complex machinery, her safety harness somehow became entangled in the gear assembly. The mechanical system continued operating, slowly but relentlessly pulling her deeper into the machinery. The massive gears began crushing her pelvis and lower torso, while the moving chains created devastating lacerations across her body. Despite her desperate attempts to reach the manual emergency stop, the positioning made it impossible. For approximately 90 seconds, Callahan remained conscious as the machinery systematically destroyed her body. The crushing injuries to her vital organs combined with massive blood loss finally ended her suffering. A maintenance janitor making his rounds at 5:45 a.m. noticed blood seeping from beneath the escalator platform. The horrific discovery launched an immediate emergency response, but it was far too late for rescue efforts. Emergency crews faced an unprecedented challenge extracting her body from the complex machinery, requiring 4 grueling hours of careful work to avoid further damage to her remains. The scene was so traumatic that several first responders required psychological counseling. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the elevator maintenance industry. Union Station immediately implemented mandatory buddy system protocols for all escalator maintenance work, ensuring no technician would ever work alone again. Additional emergency stop systems were installed throughout the facility, along with comprehensive safety equipment upgrades. Callahan's death became a catalyst for nationwide changes in escalator maintenance procedures, transforming industry standards to prevent similar tragedies. Her perfectionist approach to safety, ironically, became the foundation for protecting future generations of maintenance workers from the mechanical monsters they serviced daily. It was April 2nd, 2012, at Victoria Falls, which sits on the border between Zambia and Zimbabwe. By midday, the sun was bright and hot. Mist from the waterfall drifted across the gorge, creating faint rainbows. The roar of the water was constant, and the air was damp enough to coat the cliffs. Below, the Zambezi River surged through a narrow channel, its current so strong they could drag even the best swimmers. Daniel Royce, 33, stood near the edge of the gorge, checking his gear. He was an experienced slackliner with over 10 years of practice walking narrow webbing over dangerous terrain, spanning city skylines, mountain valleys, and deep canyons. This attempt was his most ambitious yet, a 1,200-foot walk over the Zambezi River, directly above the turbulent waters of the fall's lower gorge. A team of local climbers and rigging specialists had set up the line the day before. They anchored the industrial-grade webbing into rock faces on both sides and tensioned it for stability, though some natural sway was inevitable. The line was about 2 inches wide, enough for a foot, but nothing more. Event rules required Daniel to wear a safety harness attached to a leash that ran along the line. It wouldn't prevent a fall, but it could stop him from hitting the river directly. Even so, falling meant he could slam into the cliff wall or hang in a dangerous position in the mist and wind. Daniel had spent months preparing for this day, training for balance and learning to adjust for moisture on the webbing. But Victoria Falls was unpredictable. Gusts of wind could sweep through the gorge without warning, and mist could make the rope slick in seconds. By the time the small crowd gathered on both sides of the gorge, conditions looked favorable. Winds were light, and the sun was high. Daniel finished his stretches, inspected the rig one last time, and stepped onto the line. His first steps were steady. He kept his knees slightly bent, arms out for balance, placing each foot carefully in the center of the webbing. The line dipped slightly under his weight, but responded well to his control. Below, the Zambezi churned and foamed, but Daniel focused only on the webbing ahead. About halfway across, he stopped briefly to reset his stance. A light breeze moved through the gorge, swaying the line just enough to require small adjustments. He handled it easily and started forward again. Then, without warning, a stronger gust swept through. Mist from the falls clung to the line, making it slippery. Daniel's right foot slipped slightly. He threw his arms wide and made a quick recovery, but the sudden movement caused the webbing to oscillate more than usual. Before the line settled, another gust, stronger than the first, hit from the opposite direction. The wet webbing and unstable sway broke his balance. Daniel fell sideways. His harness leash caught after a short drop, but momentum swung him hard into the rock wall. The impact left him semi-conscious. His body slid along the cliff until the leash pulled tight. Hanging above the rapids, Daniel tried to grab the safety line, but his grip failed. He slipped free and dropped into the river. The Zambezi's current took him immediately. Rescue boats launched from downstream, but the combination of jagged rocks and powerful water made the search difficult. Nearly 2 hours later, crews found his body several miles downriver. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma from the cliff impact, followed by drowning. Slacklining organizations later stressed that even experienced professionals face extreme risk in such environments. A single slip, combined with weather and terrain, can turn a record attempt into a fatal accident. It was August 18, 2018, in Koreatown, Los Angeles. The night air was warm, carrying the sound of distant traffic and music from nearby clubs. On top of a 5-story parking garage, 3 young men lingered at the edge, joking loudly to cover the nerves they wouldn't admit. Within an hour, one of them would lie broken on the pavement below, the sound of his fall echoing through the structure. Derek Fowler was 19, a community college student with no clear direction. His grades were inconsistent, and he drifted between part-time jobs. Among friends, he was known for his loud personality and willingness to take dares others avoided. Though he had no real TikTok following, he watched viral stunts closely, telling friends he would blow up one day. What pushed him wasn't fame on the platform, but the approval of his small circle. Risk to Derek was a shortcut to recognition, proof he was braver than the rest. Parking garages had become common filming spots in Los Angeles for their concrete edges and open views. The ledges, however, were never designed to be held onto. The smooth concrete wore slick under sweat, and any slip meant a deadly drop. Derek and his friends understood it on some level, but they convinced themselves it was just a test of grip and nerve. No safety gear was possible, just bare hands against rough stone, body weight dangling over open space. That night, Derek arrived at the garage with 2 close friends after midnight. They had watched similar videos earlier in the week and decided they could do better. One friend would film from the rooftop, angled down, while the other stood on the street to capture the drop. Derek leaned over the ledge, laughing and bragging that he could hang there for a full minute. Neither friend argued. There had been warnings. Local news had covered previous accidents from garage stunts, but in the moment they felt immune. When the cameras rolled, Derek lowered himself over the edge, his hands gripping the ledge, his feet kicking briefly before finding air. He flashed a grin toward the phone above, knuckles whitening as he held his weight. From below, the second camera recorded his dangling body against the backdrop of streetlights and passing cars. His friends shouted encouragement, telling him not to give up. Seconds dragged into half a minute. His arms trembled visibly, shoulders straining. Sweat began to bead and roll down his forearms. "Pull up, pull up," one friend yelled when they saw his grip faltering. Derek tried, jaw clenched, but his palms slipped against the concrete. In one motion, he lost hold completely. He fell the full height, striking the roof of a parked car with a metallic crash that sent alarms blaring. His body bounced and tumbled onto the asphalt, limbs twisted unnaturally. From the rooftop, his friend froze, phone still aimed at the scene. The one below screamed and sprinted toward him, shouting Derek's name. Witnesses later reported that Derek never moved after impact. Derek's funeral drew classmates, relatives, and neighbors, many speaking in hushed tones about his recklessness. His parents remained quiet, offering no statement beyond grief. The LAPD issued another reminder against dangerous stunts on high structures but filed no charges. The video was taken as evidence, a permanent record of a moment that began as a dare and ended in irreversible loss. It was July 28, 2021. The late afternoon sun cast sharp shadows across the limestone ridges of Mount Sisita in the Dolomites, where craggy peaks dropped into deep valleys below. The air was still and clear, perfect conditions for filming. Along one narrow ridge trail, a small group of hikers stopped intermittently to record footage, unaware that within minutes, their casual outing would become a tragedy. Albert Deerland, a 22-year-old Danish YouTuber and online personality, stood near the cliff edge holding a selfie stick, focused entirely on his camera screen rather than the treacherous terrain beneath his feet. His channel had built a dedicated following of over 170,000 subscribers across Scandinavia, primarily teens and young adults who followed his comedic sketches, vlogs, and travel content. Deerland wasn't a professional content creator with major sponsorships or production teams. After a period of channel inactivity, he'd begun filming again, hoping to revive his audience with international travel videos. His style was deliberately informal, often filmed solo or with friends using handheld equipment, emphasizing spontaneity over polished production values. The Dolomites had been chosen specifically for their dramatic backdrops and Instagram-friendly terrain. That afternoon, Deerland was accompanied by two friends helping with basic filming duties. They were walking a marked tourist trail along Sisita's ridgeline, where countless visitors had taken photos before. But local signage clearly cautioned hikers to stay away from unmaintained cliff edges. The limestone formations were notoriously unstable, with loose gravel and fractured rock creating deadly hazards. Deerland was attempting to record a wide-angle walking shot of himself with the spectacular cliffs as backdrop, using a smartphone mounted on a selfie stick. He wore casual sneakers instead of proper hiking boots, prioritizing aesthetics over safety for his video content. According to statements given to local police and alpine rescue personnel, Deerland had gradually edged closer to an overhang of loose gravel and fractured limestone. One friend had reportedly warned him about getting too close to the unstable edge. Moments later, disaster struck. His foot slipped on the crumbling surface. He lurched sideways, desperately trying to regain footing, but the ground gave way beneath him like paper. He disappeared over the edge without making a sound, plummeting roughly 650 feet down a sheer vertical face into the valley below. His companions' screams echoed across the mountain as they frantically dialed emergency services. Other nearby hikers also alerted authorities. A mountain rescue helicopter was dispatched immediately from Bolzano, with crews locating Deerland's body quickly using drone assistance within an hour. Rescue personnel descended on foot to confirm the fatality. Deerland was pronounced dead at the scene from massive blunt force trauma. His body was carefully airlifted out after sunset, ending a young life dedicated to entertaining others online. The Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs confirmed his death the following morning. His remains were returned to Denmark for a quiet funeral attended by family and close friends. His mother issued a brief statement requesting privacy during their grief. News spread rapidly through Scandinavian media, with fans posting tributes and memorial artwork. Fellow YouTubers shared condolences but refrained from speculation or reposting footage. The video he'd been filming was never released. Italian authorities issued renewed warnings about filming near unsecured alpine ledges, adding barriers and multilingual danger signs to prevent future tragedies at the site. It was February 7, 2016, and fresh powder snow blanketed the backcountry slopes of Colorado's San Juan Mountains. The morning sun cast long blue shadows across the pristine wilderness, where untouched snow beckoned to skiers seeking the ultimate powder experience. The crisp mountain air carried the silence that only deep winter can bring, broken occasionally by the distant crack of settling snow layers. Jake Peterson adjusted his avalanche beacon as he surveyed the steep slope that had captured his imagination for months. At 31, the professional extreme skier had built his reputation tackling the most challenging and dangerous terrain in North America, earning sponsorships and magazine covers through his fearless approach to mountain skiing. His muscular frame and weathered face reflected years of pushing limits in the world's most remote mountain ranges. The backcountry expedition represented the culmination of months of planning and preparation. Jake had studied weather patterns, snow conditions, and avalanche reports with the obsessive attention to detail that had kept him alive through countless dangerous descents. Despite avalanche warnings issued for the area, his confidence in his abilities and safety equipment convinced him the risks were manageable. Jake's usual skiing partner had canceled the trip due to safety concerns, but Jake decided to proceed alone rather than miss the perfect powder conditions. His backpack contained all the standard avalanche safety equipment: beacon, probe, and shovel, gear that had saved his life on previous occasions. The slope Jake had chosen stretched 2,000 feet down the mountainside, with an average pitch of 38 degrees, steep enough to generate tremendous speed but not so extreme as to be unskiable. Fresh snow from the previous night's storm had created 18 inches of new powder over an older, more stable base layer. Jake pushed off from the ridge, his skis cutting through the powder in perfect rhythm as he carved elegant turns down the steep face. For the first 500 feet, everything went exactly as planned, deep powder flying around him like smoke as he descended through the pristine wilderness. Then, without warning, the entire slope began to move. The slab avalanche Jake triggered was massive, extending 300 feet wide and fracturing 4 feet deep into the snowpack. The entire slope began sliding as one cohesive unit, carrying Jake helplessly down the mountain at increasing speed. His years of avalanche training kicked in as he fought to stay on top of the moving snow, but the sheer volume of the slide overwhelmed his efforts. Jake tumbled through the avalanche for over 1,000 feet, his body battered against rocks and trees as the snow carried him toward the valley floor. His avalanche beacon was damaged during the violent ride. Its plastic case cracked and electronics scrambled by the impacts. When the avalanche finally stopped, Jake found himself buried under 8 feet of concrete hard snow that had set like cement around his body. He'd survived the initial burial and managed to create a small air pocket around his face, but the compressed snow made movement impossible. Search and rescue teams worked frantically for 6 hours, using probe lines and avalanche dogs to locate Jake's position. When they finally reached him, hypothermia and suffocation had already claimed his life. The experienced skier who'd conquered mountains around the world had been defeated by the very element that had given him so much joy. It was September 14th, 2015. The narrow lane behind Howrah Market buzzed with the day's final movements. Amir Ali, a 27-year-old tailor, turned off the bare bulb inside his workshop and stepped into the alley that would claim his life. Amir was just a craftsman with steady hands, and a growing clientele who rented a small ground-floor unit, working long hours stitching saris, school uniforms, and cheap men's trousers. Clients described him as polite and serious, always undercharging regulars. His calloused fingers moved with practiced precision across fabric, building a modest life one stitch at a time. But 3 months earlier, everything changed. A street gang with links to a local counselor approached Amir with a proposition that would destroy his quiet existence. They demanded he help funnel campaign funds through bogus tailoring orders, a common scheme in Kolkata's political underworld. Amir refused, unwilling to compromise his integrity for dirty money. The consequences came swiftly. Posters appeared near his shop calling him a traitor to the ward. A local tea stall vendor warned him to stay careful. Friends urged him to relocate, but Amir stayed. He told neighbors he wouldn't be bullied out of the life he'd built with his own hands. That Monday afternoon, Amir worked until just past 5 o'clock. As he pulled the corrugated shutter halfway down, he waved to Sumita Sharma, a widow who lived in the next unit. She smiled and began locking her gate. Neither saw the two men waiting. Sumita heard it first. Raised voices, the scrape of metal against stone. When she stepped outside, she witnessed Amir being dragged into the narrow passage by two men in jeans and sandals. One wore a bandana over his mouth. They pinned Amir against the wall beside his sewing machine. He fought desperately, blocking the first swing of a metal rod, twisting out of their grip, but one attacker slammed the rod across Amir's shoulder, and he staggered. The second plunged a short knife into his chest. Amir fell hard onto concrete, blood spreading around his legs. The taller man struck again, this time to his skull. His body went still. Sumita screamed and ran for help. Two men from a nearby fruit stall rushed in, grabbing one attacker while the other fled. Amir lay motionless beside his broken sewing stool, blood seeping into half-stitched uniforms scattered across the floor. An ambulance arrived 20 minutes later, but Amir had already succumbed to head trauma and blood loss. His body was taken to a government hospital, then released for cremation. Neighbors left garlands and candles at the shuttered shop. Amir's funeral was held the next morning at the local mosque, attended by family, clients, and fellow artisans who quietly walked behind the hearse through the old market lanes. His sewing machine, still stained, was later moved to his parents' home in Baruipur. Within 48 hours, police confirmed the arrest of one suspect and launched a search for the second. Officials also opened a parallel investigation into the counselor's alleged ties to the extortion ring. It was September 8, 2018, when Chelsea Whitmore's lifelong fear of heights would become her final undoing in the most ironic way imaginable. Chelsea, a 34-year-old balloon artist from Albuquerque, New Mexico, had built her career around the very things that terrified her most. Despite suffering from severe acrophobia, she operated Skybound Celebrations, a novelty balloon business that brought joy to countless children's parties. Her specialty was creating massive character balloons that floated majestically above birthday celebrations. A perfectionist by nature, Chelsea was meticulous about every detail of her craft. She had spent years mastering the delicate balance between helium ratios and balloon materials, always pushing boundaries. Her backyard workshop was filled with colorful latex creations, each one a testament to her artistic vision. As the annual Albuquerque International Balloon Fiesta approached, Chelsea was preparing her most ambitious project, a colossal 15-foot SpongeBob SquarePants balloon for a major client's corporate event. She had been experimenting with ultra-lightweight helium mixtures, hoping to achieve unprecedented buoyancy. That Saturday afternoon around 3:30 p.m., Chelsea was in her backyard workshop, carefully inflating the massive yellow balloon. The SpongeBob creation was nearly complete, its cartoon features taking shape as helium filled the specially designed chambers. What she hadn't anticipated was how the balloon's enormous size would react to desert winds. As Chelsea worked to secure the balloon to a heavy concrete anchor block, she became entangled in the complex network of guide ropes. The ropes, designed to keep the balloon stable during inflation, wrapped around her waist and legs as she maneuvered around the massive creation. Without warning, a powerful 35-mile-per-hour wind gust struck the area, common for September afternoons in New Mexico. The combination of the balloon's massive surface area and the ultra-light helium mixture created the perfect storm. The SpongeBob balloon, with Chelsea still entangled in its anchor lines, was lifted violently into the air. Neighbors watched in horror as Chelsea was carried carried approximately 200 feet above the residential neighborhood, her small frame dangling helplessly from the ropes. For nearly 4 agonizing minutes, witnesses could see her struggling desperately to free herself, her acrophobia making the situation even more terrifying. The balloon's fabric, not designed to handle such stress, began showing signs of failure at 180 feet altitude. Small tears appeared in the material, causing rapid decompression and erratic movement. The balloon lurched and spun unpredictably as helium escaped through the growing ruptures. Then, catastrophically, Chelsea fell. Her body plummeted at terminal velocity, impacting a concrete driveway 3 blocks from her workshop. The fall resulted in complete skeletal fractures and massive internal organ damage, killing her instantly. The partially deflated SpongeBob balloon continued drifting before coming to rest several blocks away. Emergency responders arrived within 8 minutes, but could only confirm what witnesses already knew. The incident, captured on multiple cell phone videos, quickly went viral, spreading across social media platforms within hours. The tragedy prompted New Mexico to implement stricter safety regulations for commercial balloon operations. The irony of Chelsea's fate was not lost on those who knew her best. A woman who had spent her entire adult life afraid of heights, yet dedicated her career to creating objects that soared through the sky, had ultimately been claimed by the very thing she both feared and loved most. It was September 8, 2017. Off the coast of Dahab, Egypt, the Red Sea was calm under the morning sun, but just offshore sat the Blue Hole, a vertical sinkhole dropping hundreds of feet into darkness. Divers around the world knew it for its beauty, but also for its deadly record. More than 100 people had died there, most from pushing far beyond safe diving limits. Eric Dawson, 34, from the United Kingdom, stood on the rocky shore checking his gear. He had years of recreational diving experience in tropical vacation spots, but he wasn't a trained technical diver. His past dives had been in warm, shallow water, nothing like the extreme depths he planned to reach that day. Eric had spent months planning the dive, studying maps of the Blue Hole and reading accounts from others who had attempted extreme depths there. He wanted to test his limits and see how far he could push himself underwater. For him, this trip was about personal achievement and the challenge of completing one of the most difficult dives in the world. To save money, Eric skipped hiring a full safety team. Instead, he brought along Khalid, a local underwater photographer. Khalid had no training for deep technical dives, but he agreed to film from a safer depth while Eric went for his record attempt. The weather was perfect. The water was clear, with sunlight streaming down the reef walls. Eric entered the water and began descending along the vertical drop. His plan was to go beyond 300 feet before starting a slow, staged descent to avoid decompression sickness. By the time he passed 200 feet, the water temperature had dropped sharply, and the pressure on his body was extreme. Khaled stopped at 130 feet, watching Eric's figure fade into the blue below. At around 300 feet, Eric began feeling the effects of nitrogen narcosis, a mental fog caused by breathing compressed air at high pressure. It slowed his thinking and made reading his depth gauge harder. Instead of turning back immediately, Eric paused at about 350 feet to adjust his camera, losing precious ascent time. When he finally started going up, he moved too quickly. Panic appeared to set in as he overshot his planned decompression stops. Khaled noticed his erratic movement and swam down to meet him at 130 feet. By then, Eric's eyes were glassy and his breathing was shallow. They stopped for decompression, but halfway through, Eric went completely limp. Khaled tried to bring him to the surface, but without training in deep water rescues, he rushed the ascent. The speed skipped several safety stops, making the situation even worse. On the surface, the boat crew pulled Eric aboard. They started CPR immediately and called for emergency help. Within minutes, Eric began to seize, a clear sign of severe decompression sickness, before falling unconscious. Paramedics met the boat at the pier and took over resuscitation efforts, but it was too late. Eric was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators later confirmed the cause of death as a combination of nitrogen narcosis, rapid ascent, and decompression sickness. His camera footage cut off during the ascent, right before Khaled's attempt to pull him up. Local diving authorities used Eric's death as a warning to others. Deep technical dives require specialized training, the right breathing gases, and a qualified support team. Without them, even experienced recreational divers face overwhelming risks. It was November 14, 2019 in Moscow. The late afternoon light was already fading, and the air carried a sharp chill. Along the banks of the Moskva River, a small group of teenagers gathered at the base of a bridge. laughing nervously and checking the recording angles on their phones. None of them said it aloud, but the silence of the cold river below made the game feel heavier than they admitted. By nightfall, their dare would end with one of them gone. Anastasia Ivanova was 16, a quiet schoolgirl who often blended into the background of her classes. Among friends, however, she was drawn to the sense of belonging that came with shared risks. She had begun following thrill-seeking videos on TikTok earlier that year, fascinated by the adrenaline of dares she would never attempt alone. Unlike others who chased popularity, Anastasia wanted recognition only from her small circle of friends. Risk wasn't natural to her, but it was something she tolerated to stay included. The bridge they chose that evening spanned a shallow stretch of the Moskva. The drop was not enormous, but the stone supports broke the surface in uneven ways, and the river's November current was icy and fast. The water's depth varied, deep enough for a clean landing in one spot, but dangerously shallow just feet away. Locals knew the river well and avoided swimming past early autumn. The teenagers, armed with only a phone camera, overlooked those risks, focusing instead on how dramatic the footage might look against the city backdrop. The plan was to climb the railing and jump in, one after another. Two girls went first, leaping quickly and splashing down. Their laughter was strained as they fought the freezing water, shivering while pulling themselves toward the bank. Anastasia climbed next, gripping the railing tightly, her face pale. One friend teased her hesitation, and the others laughed. She shook her head, still clinging to the metal, but after more urging, she shifted her weight forward. Eyewitnesses later said she looked terrified, holding her breath as if bracing for pain. As she pushed off, her foot caught on the iron railing, twisting her body sideways in midair. She slammed into a stone support with her shoulder and head, the impact producing a sickening crack that several bystanders swore they heard from above. The blow likely fractured her skull, and a smear of blood marked the stone before her body flipped. She plunged headfirst into the river, striking the surface at an angle with a heavy, lifeless thud before vanishing beneath the black water. Her friends screamed in panic. Two of them jumped in despite the shock of the icy current, which clawed at their chests and made breathing difficult. When they reached her, she was limp, arms floating unnaturally, her eyes half open but unresponsive. They grabbed hold of her under the arms, dragging her toward the bank. They shouted her name over and over, their voices breaking in fear. Witnesses on shore pointed to the red stain spreading in the water and ran to call emergency services. Paramedics arrived minutes later, hauling her onto the embankment. Her skin was pale, lips already turning blue from the cold, and blood ran freely from the gash in her scalp. They began chest compressions and tried to ventilate her, but she showed no response. The wound on her head continued to seep as they worked, pooling beneath her on the concrete. After more than 20 minutes of effort, she was pronounced dead at the scene. Anastasia's funeral was quiet, held in her neighborhood church with classmates and teachers present. Her parents requested privacy, refusing media coverage. Moscow authorities issued another blanket warning about dangerous online challenges, but enforcement was minimal, and the videos continued. It was July 29, 2019. The evening heat lingered over the red rock mesas of southern Utah as twilight approached. Beyond the edge of a private airstrip in Washington County, a faint buzzing echoed across the desert as a paramotor arced into the darkening sky. Within minutes, the sound cut out abruptly. By nightfall, no one had heard from the pilot, and a search would soon reveal one of YouTube's most tragic losses. Grant Thompson, a 38-year-old creator behind the King of Random YouTube channel, had built his reputation combining backyard science with controlled experiments and spectacular builds. Since 2010, he'd grown his subscriber base into the millions by blending curiosity with accessible spectacle, launching dry ice rockets, melting metal, and testing physics in ways that captivated viewers worldwide. As a licensed pilot, Thompson had developed a serious interest in powered paragliding, sometimes incorporating aerial footage into his channel as supplementary material. Paramotoring combines the freedom of paragliding with motorized propulsion, allowing pilots to launch from flat ground and soar at low altitudes across varied terrain. But mechanical failures at low altitude leave virtually no room for recovery. That July afternoon, Thompson drove to a remote area near a quiet airfield, planning to film new paramotor footage using recently mounted camera equipment. He hadn't filed a flight plan, standard practice for low-altitude recreational flights in rural Utah. He texted a colleague before takeoff but gave no indication of his planned flight duration or route. When Thompson failed to check in that evening, his family grew increasingly concerned. A GPS tracker on his phone showed irregular flight patterns, circling movements that abruptly stopped mid-transmission. Local authorities were contacted immediately, launching a search operation before sunrise. Just after dawn on July 30th, a Washington County search and rescue team located the wreckage in scrubland several miles from the nearest road. Thompson was found deceased at the crash site. The paramotor wing was partially collapsed and tangled, while the frame showed evidence of high-speed ground impact. Remarkably, his onboard camera survived, recording several minutes of normal flight followed by a sharp, sudden descent. Investigators later recovered GPS logs and fragmented helmet footage from the wreckage. The final seconds showed a violent mid-air shudder, followed by a sudden nosedive. Then screaming wind, spinning terrain, and a sharp, abrupt impact. The pilot's body was dismembered by the force. His torso was thrown nearly 40 feet from the fuselage. While the exact cause couldn't be confirmed due to corrupted telemetry, the evidence pointed to a catastrophic stall triggered by either mechanical failure or a sudden wind shear. Pilot error and sabotage were ruled out. The Federal Aviation Administration temporarily closed local airspace for 2 days during the investigation. News of Thompson's death was announced through the King of Random's official social media channels and confirmed in a tribute video posted by his collaborators, featuring highlights of his innovative work. His funeral was held privately in Utah, with fans and fellow YouTubers sharing condolences across multiple platforms. Tribute compilations emerged throughout the following week, celebrating his contributions to science education and creative experimentation. It was September 30th, 2014, and the desert sun blazed overhead as tourists gathered at the entrance to Antelope Canyon in Arizona. The narrow slot canyon stretched deep into the earth, its sculpted sandstone walls creating a natural cathedral where shafts of sunlight painted ethereal beams across the flowing rock formations. The air hung still and heavy, carrying the earthy scent of ancient stone and the distant rumble of thunder from storms brewing miles away. Michael Torres checked his weather radio one final time as he prepared to lead his group into the canyon's depths. At 29, the experienced tour guide had safely escorted hundreds of visitors through these narrow passages, earning a reputation for his knowledge of the canyon's geology and his commitment to safety. His sun-weathered face and calloused hands reflected years of desert guiding, while his easy smile put nervous tourists at ease. The morning weather briefing had mentioned possible thunderstorms in the region, but they appeared to be developing far to the north and east, well away from the canyon system. Michael's group consisted of 12 excited tourists, including 2 families with young children who'd traveled from across the country to witness the famous light beams that made Antelope Canyon a photographer's paradise. Michael had been guiding in slot canyons for over 5 years, developing an intuitive understanding of weather patterns and flood risks. The canyon's narrow walls, carved by millions of years of flash flooding, created both its beauty and its danger, a fact Michael never let his clients forget. As the group descended into the canyon's narrow confines, Michael pointed out the geological features that made the location so spectacular. The walls rose 120 feet above them, sometimes narrowing to just 3 feet wide, creating an otherworldly environment where sound echoed strangely and light took on magical qualities. 15 miles upstream, heavy rainfall had begun without warning as a sudden thunderstorm developed with unusual intensity. The desert's hard-packed earth couldn't absorb the massive volume of water, sending torrents rushing toward the lower elevations where Michael's group explored the canyon's deepest sections. The first sign of danger came as a distant rumbling sound that Michael initially mistook for aircraft passing overhead, but his years of experience quickly identified the ominous noise as something far more threatening. The roar of approaching floodwater channeled through the narrow canyon system. Michael immediately ordered everyone to climb the canyon walls, his voice cutting through their casual conversation with urgent authority. The tourists looked confused as he began pushing them toward any handhold or ledge that might offer escape from the canyon floor. The wall of water hit the canyon with the force of a freight train, carrying boulders, debris, and thousands of gallons of churning brown water. Michael managed to boost several tourists to safety before the flood swept him and 3 others into the violent current. The canyon walls amplified the roar of the water as it battered everything in its path. Those who'd reached safety watched helplessly as Michael disappeared beneath the surface, his body tumbling through the rapids like a rag doll. The experienced guide who'd spent years protecting others was powerless against the raw force of nature unleashed in the narrow confines he knew so well. Michael's body was found over a mile downstream, trapped beneath debris and rocks where the floodwater had finally deposited its deadly cargo. The incident led to immediate closure of all Slot Canyon tours during monsoon season, while advanced weather monitoring systems were installed to provide real-time flood warnings for tour operators. It was June 19, 2017. A quiet winter evening was settling over Melbourne's outer suburbs, and the Dandenong Creek Trail had thinned out from its usual bustle of cyclists and commuters. Grace Thompson ran alone along a wooded stretch, her breath visible in the chill air, earbuds in, jacket zipped high, unaware she was running toward her final moments. Grace was a 29-year-old child welfare caseworker at a mid-sized NGO focused on family support services, dedicated to protecting vulnerable children and families. Her colleagues described her as thorough and principled, qualities that had recently put her life in danger. In the months prior, Grace had submitted detailed internal reports exposing financial mismanagement by senior staff, specifically inflated travel reimbursements and grant money diverted to personal expenses. While the board took public steps toward reform, Grace privately told a friend that one board member, Darren O., had become cold and hostile, believing she had made him a target. Grace maintained a strict routine: office by 8 a.m., field visits midday, trail run after work. That Monday, she left the building at 5:12 p.m., still wearing her staff ID clipped to her pocket. The trail entrance was 5 minutes from her apartment, a familiar path she'd run hundreds of times before. At approximately 5:41 p.m., Paul Chen was jogging 60 feet behind Grace when he witnessed something that would haunt him forever. A man in a gray hoodie stepped from the brush. Paul initially thought he might be homeless until he noticed the gun in the man's hand. The man blocked Grace's path and demanded that she hand over her phone. She removed one earbud, confused, as he told her to delete the files. Grace backed away, refusing, and the man raised a small black revolver and shot her once in the abdomen at close range. She collapsed instantly onto the cold asphalt. Paul shouted and sprinted toward them, but the gunman fled into the adjacent woodland. Paul remained with Grace, who was bleeding heavily from the wound. Struggling to speak, she asked him for help as he pressed his jacket against the injury and called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within 11 minutes. Grace was rushed to Royal Melbourne Hospital in critical condition, underwent emergency surgery, but died 2 hours later from internal bleeding. Detectives recovered CCTV footage from a nearby park entrance, showing Darren O. lingering in the area shortly before the attack. He was arrested the next morning and charged with premeditated murder. Grace's funeral was held 4 days later at a small church in Ferntree Gully, attended by family, co-workers, and several former clients who credited her with changing their lives. Her parents requested no media presence, and the service remained quiet, personal, and untelevised. In response to her death, Victoria Police launched a review of threats against whistleblowers in non-profit sectors. Officials opened a separate inquiry into the NGO's financial practices and board oversight procedures. It was November 12, 2017, when 33-year-old Courtney Baxter arrived at a residential property in Asheville, North Carolina, carrying mounting financial pressures. As a certified arborist with over a decade of experience, Baxter had built a reputation for meticulous tree removal, but recent economic struggles forced him to take on more jobs and cut preparation time. The towering 150-year-old oak tree stood like a monument, reaching nearly 80 feet into the crisp autumn sky. From outside, the massive trunk appeared solid and healthy, showing only minor signs of age. What Baxter couldn't see was extensive internal decay that had silently hollowed out the tree's core for decades. creating a hidden cavity that would become his tomb. Neighbors watched as he unloaded climbing gear and chainsaw equipment at 8 a.m., noting his professional demeanor despite his rushed timeline. The job seemed straightforward: remove the diseased oak threatening the nearby house. Standard procedure called for a top-down approach, systematically removing branches before tackling the main trunk. Baxter secured his harness and began ascending, experienced hands finding purchase on familiar bark. At 35 feet up, he positioned himself for the first major cut. Morning air filled with chainsaw roar as the blade bit into what appeared solid wood. Then everything went catastrophically wrong. The chainsaw blade suddenly broke through into empty space, the hollow interior that decades of rot had carved out. The trunk wall's structural integrity, already compromised by decay, couldn't withstand the sudden removal of supporting wood. A section collapsed inward with a sickening crack. Baxter plummeted through the opening into the tree's hidden cavity, a narrow prison approximately 20 inches wide and 8 feet deep. His climbing harness and rope, designed to save his life, became instruments of doom as they wedged against irregular interior walls. The confined space held him vertically, unable to move or adjust. Trapped within the wooden tomb, Baxter's desperate shouts were muffled by thick walls. His radio and phone remained frustratingly out of reach, arms pinned by narrow confines. The cruel irony wasn't lost. Imprisoned within the very tree he'd come to remove, its hollow heart becoming his final resting place. The restricted vertical position began taking its deadly toll. Unable to shift weight or change position, pressure on his chest and diaphragm gradually increased. Positional asphyxia, a silent killer claiming victims trapped in positions restricting breathing, began its relentless work. For approximately 45 minutes, Baxter fought against his wooden prison, breathing becoming increasingly labored as his body struggled against the unnatural position. The century-and-a-half-old tree claimed its final victim, holding him in a hollow embrace until strength finally gave out. When Baxter failed to arrive at his 2 p.m. appointment, concern grew rapidly. His punctuality reputation made the absence immediately suspicious. Family members arrived at 4:30 p.m., finding his truck parked exactly where he'd left it. Faint sounds from within the massive oak seemed impossible. Rescue crews arrived with specialized cutting equipment, working frantically to create access. But precious time had run out. Baxter had succumbed hours earlier. The tragic incident sent shockwaves through the arborist community, highlighting hidden dangers even experienced professionals face. New safety protocols were immediately implemented, requiring thorough internal cavity assessments before cutting operations. Courtney Baxter's death serves as a sobering reminder that nature's beauty often conceals deadly secrets, and even the most experienced can fall victim to unexpected dangers lurking within seemingly routine tasks. It was October 4, 2013, in the western Caucasus Mountains of Abkhazia, Georgia. The entrance to Krubera Cave opened wide in the limestone hillside. Dark and cold, moss covered the rocks, and water dripped steadily from above. Inside lay the deepest known cave in the world, dropping more than 7,200 feet through steep vertical shafts, narrow tunnels, and water-filled passages where the temperature stayed close to freezing all year. Jacob Ilyev adjusted his caving equipment as he prepared for the descent that would either establish his legacy or claim his life. At 41, the Bulgarian caver had spent more than 2 decades exploring subterranean systems across Europe, earning recognition in the community for his technical skill and calm under pressure. His weathered helmet and scarred gear reflected countless hours spent navigating the world's most challenging underground environments. The world record attempt represented Jacob's goal to achieve the deepest dry descent without diving equipment through Krubera's flooded sections, a feat that demanded precision, endurance, and absolute discipline. Unlike cavers who specialized in mixed dry and scuba exploration, Marco insisted on maintaining a dry-only approach that would push the boundaries of what was considered possible in deep cave systems. The expedition began with support from a small, experienced team that assisted with initial rigging, gear hauling, and documentation of the attempt. In the early stages, they helped Jacob navigate long vertical drops using fixed ropes, while hauling packs through squeezes that barely allowed room for helmets and equipment. The deeper they descended, the more unstable the cave became as wet rock, constant water drip, and loose stone made footing increasingly hazardous. By nearly 5,000 feet in depth, The cave had narrowed into a vertical shaft with slick, uneven surfaces, where most cavers either turned back or switched to scuba gear to continue into flooded passages. Jacob's determination to maintain his dry-only approach led him to insist on continuing alone into the unstable section, despite his team's objections about exponentially increased risks of solo travel at such depths. The shaft walls glistened with moisture as the sound of dripping water echoed endlessly in the absolute darkness. Jacob descended carefully, his hands gripping the rope while his boots sought small ledges for balance in the confined space. For several minutes, progress remained steady as he methodically worked his way deeper into the Earth's interior. A single misstep changed everything. When Jacob's right foot slipped on a patch of algae-slick rock in the narrow shaft, his body shifted sideways, throwing his center of gravity off the rope line as he tried desperately to recover. The confined walls and awkward rope position left no room for correction, as his boot lost its hold entirely. The fall was short but violent as Jacob's body slammed into the shaft wall before tumbling onto a ledge nearly 30 feet below. The impact knocked him unconscious instantly, leaving him alone in the depths, with no one within immediate reach to render aid. His years of experience and technical skill proved meaningless against the unforgiving physics of falling rock and human fragility. His team knew something was wrong when he stopped moving, so they carefully made their way down. The narrow shaft and loose rocks slowed them, and when they reached him, he wasn't breathing. Getting him out of that depth would take hours of dangerous climbing through tight, unstable passages. Over the next 2 days, rescuers from multiple local caving clubs coordinated the extraction using specialized haul systems while working in shifts to navigate the exhausting climb toward daylight. The cold and damp conditions sapped energy from everyone involved as they methodically transported Jacob's body through the same passages that had challenged him in life. The official conclusion confirmed that a slip on wet rock in the narrow shaft had caused a fatal fall, where survival chances were virtually non-existent at such depths. It was March 12, 2019, on the outskirts of Bhopal, India. The sun had set an hour earlier, leaving the fields around the railway crossing in dim light, punctuated only by the faint glow of the town in the distance. A few boys lingered by the tracks, restless and laughing, the kind of nervous energy that hides unease. The steel rails hummed faintly, signaling the approach of something massive. By morning, one family's life would be permanently altered. Arjun Mehra was 17, a first-year college student who never stood out in class. His grades were average, his attendance spotty, and he was known mostly for tagging along with louder friends. Reserved by nature, he had found a small sense of belonging on TikTok, where he uploaded shaky videos of dares and antics that drew a few hundred views from peers. He wasn't chasing fame, just recognition in a life that felt otherwise invisible. To his friends, he was the one who could be goaded into going further, testing how close he could get to danger without flinching. Railway tracks outside the city had become a popular backdrop for these dares. India's rail network, among the busiest in the world, saw passenger trains hurtle by at speeds that left little margin for error. The sheer mass of a train created strong suction, capable of pulling a person off balance. Local authorities had long warned against loitering near tracks, but enforcement was thin. For boys like Arjun and his friends, the tracks weren't just dangerous, they were a stage, a place to prove themselves under the cover of darkness. That evening, the plan was simple. Film themselves standing as close as possible to the passing train, posting the clip later with a caption about bravery. It wasn't new, others had done the same, but the unspoken rule was to outdo the last attempt. When they reached the crossing, one boy took out his phone, holding it steady as the group positioned themselves. The distant horn of the train echoed through the night. One friend muttered that they were already too close, but Arjun scoffed, stepping forward until his toes nearly touched the gravel shoulder. The others shouted at him to hold back, but he only grinned. The ground began to shake, the low rumble swelling into a roar. The headlight beam grew larger, flooding the tracks with blinding light. Arjun tilted his chin toward the phone, as though daring the machine itself. His friends, just behind him, shifted nervously. One shouted again for him to move, voice cracking with panic. The train bore down at full speed, a wall of steel and sound. At the last second, the force struck. Witnesses later said it looked as if the air itself had ripped him from where he stood. The edge of the train caught his arm and shoulder, snapping bone with a crack that carried even over the roar. He spun violently, slammed against the side of the speeding car, and was sucked down into the gap. The wheels tore through him with a grinding thud, shredding his body against the ballast in a spray of blood and fragments. His friends screamed, stumbling back as the phone slipped from one boy's hand, still recording the blur of steel rushing past. When the final carriage vanished into the dark, the sudden silence was filled only by gasps, sobs, and the sight of what had been left behind on the tracks. Police arrived after a frantic call from nearby residents. They recovered the phone, its screen cracked, but still playing the final moments. The footage circulated briefly before authorities pressured social media platforms to suppress it. At Arjun's funeral, held quietly the following day, relatives wept but said little publicly. Among friends, guilt hung heavy. They admitted they had egged him on, each one pushing the dare further until the line had been crossed. The Railway Protection Force issued a new warning against filming near tracks, placing additional guards at busy crossings. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.